Welcome everybody. It's lovely to see you here. There may be some more coming, but I think we should start now. So some of you are seeing newcomers, so welcome to Central London Humanists and welcome to some old friends. I'm just going to announce a few things at the start of events we've got coming up before we get on to tonight's speakers. So on the 27th, what are we today? Okay, so on the 27th it's the book group discussing The Spy and the Traitor by Ben McIntyre. So that's at 7 o'clock at the Festival Hall. On 28th, the theatre group are going to Peter Gynt at the National Theatre.
Peer Gynt, I think.
Sorry?
Peer Gynt.
No, it's Peter Gynt.
Is it me?
It's based on Peer Gynt, but it's a takeoff. It's a kind of takeoff of Peer Gynt with Peter Gynt.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. And actually we have a spare ticket because someone who was going now can't, so we'd love to have more anyway, but particularly we have a spare ticket. So that will be at 6:30 on the 28th. On the 29th, if you remember, Satna, who I think may be coming tonight, but she's not here now, and Andy, at our AGM, wanted us to sort of celebrate, to mark the seasons, and we did it in spring, by the sort of spring equinox, and this weekend, of course, is the summer solstice, but it's the Humanist Conference in Leicester, so quite a few people will be there. So on the 29th, they're going to hold a picnic celebrating the change of seasons. It's going to go from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. and it'll be at the Serpentine Bar and Kitchen, which is sort of in Hyde Park, isn't it? And people know where that is. Okay, so that's on the 29th. On the 30th, we have our monthly lunch at Penrose Oak at 1 o'clock. And then on the 3rd of July is the weekday social, again at Penrose Oak. Those are at 6:30 p.m. And on the 14th of July, we have our monthly discussion group, which is also at Penrose Oak. They start at 3, and you can vote on the meetup site for what topic you would like to discuss. I don't know if you want to say more about that, AJ. You're going to suggest some topics, or you will see. You go into that event on the meetup site, which is sort of rather faintly behind me, and you can look for that topic. And then on the 27th of July, although this is more than a month ahead, I thought I'd mention it because it's a big event, is our annual Ancestors Trail in Epping Forest. So I think that starts about 9:45, depending whether you're a human or a gazelle, or if you're like me, a plant, you can have a bit of a lion and start later in the day, and the bacteria later. So do look that up, it's great fun each year. We're doing it slightly differently this year, but it will be the similar walks in Epping Forest, and we will all meet at the end of the day. We will meet at our various common ancestors and hear about them. It's kind of enacting Richard Dawkins' book, The Ancestor's Tale, and we make it The Ancestor's Trail. And it's
we'll meet some Neanderthals there?
Yes, we'll definitely meet Neanderthals. We'll definitely meet some primordial creatures out of the swamp. That's what we all end up as. Actually, there was another thing I was going to mention, and I should have rewritten, but the Humanist Choir has got a couple of concerts coming up, so I'll be putting those on the meetup site, so do look at those as well. Anything else I should be announcing? Is that the things for the next month? Okay, so now to come on to tonight's speaker, when we're very honoured to have Dr Brian Beeley, who is a retired university academic, and he's got a very long-standing interest in the Middle East. He spent a year in a Turkish village as a young student. In 1956, he couldn't understand why Britain had invaded Egypt, and that got him focused on that area of the world. I used to run an organisation that provided speakers to schools, and Brian often used to go and speak to schools on the Holy Land, and he was always our best acclaimed speaker. They will beg to have him again, so I think we're very lucky to have him tonight. He doesn't think of the world in terms of good guys and bad guys. He tries to give a sort of balanced view and present both sides of both perspectives. He feels the Middle East is of particular interest to humanists because there's so much religious sort of divide there, and there are a lot of religious justifications of the different viewpoints. So it's quite interesting for us to look at the effects of religion in the Middle East. He was saying that President Trump has changed the elements of the conflict in the Holy Land by supporting Netanyahu in giving up the two-state solution, which has been, you know, the official doctrine for quite a long time, even though it's become less and less likely. Now, what Brian has very kindly done is he's produced a handout for us, and obviously, really it's for you to go and read afterwards, bless him. He says if you haven't fully appreciated what he said, then you can read about it afterwards. But it's got quite a useful map on the back. So he's asked me to distribute it now so you've got the map, but perhaps you can leave the reading till afterwards if that's all right. So I welcome Brian Beeley. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Tricia. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your generous words of introduction. Yes, the piece of paper going round just now is indeed an attempt in one and a little bit of a page to summarise the conflict that I'm talking about, the Israel-Palestine conflict. So it's history, if you like. I also have another handout, which is this one, which attempts to summarise what I'm saying this evening. So if you can't understand what I've said, take this one away and all might become more comprehensible. But we can either, Tricia, we can either pass this one around now. People shouldn't read it till they're in bed, or on the bus or somewhere.
We'll pass that around later because they don't need it now. It's just for the now.
Give me a copy so I can remember what I'm doing.
And I should have just mentioned, Brian will speak for about 30-40 minutes, and we'll have a brief break for you to charge your glasses, and then we'll have discussion, comments, and so on.
Yes, Tricia is right. As a long-time retired academic, I approach my interest in the Middle East as far as these subjects are concerned in as far as is possible, a neutral, unbiased way. And immediately one has to say, well, that's impossible, because you can't be neutral and unbiased if you use language. You can't say that if some security force is apprehended a violent militant, you can't say this is exactly the same as saying some occupation troops seized a freedom fighter. You might be talking about precisely the same thing, and the choice of words has given away a stance. So bias is inevitable, and I'm just as vulnerable to that. But I try to avoid the word should. I couldn't care less what should happen, insofar as what I'm trying to do is to understand what is happening, what might happen, and what options there are, and which options might be chosen by which people for what reasons. So I'll start by saying, as I think Tricia touched on, that I think it's a very good time to talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Because 100 years after Balfour, we've got Trump, who is another Balfour in the sense that he represents a country which doesn't control the Holy Land. And yet he's making pronouncements, both of them have made pronouncements, which are going to have a very important effect on what happens in the Holy Land. And that is going to have an enormous effect on what happens in the Middle East, which will affect us. Balfour, as you know, he had a two-part proposal on behalf of the British government about part of the Ottoman Empire, which was that there should be a Jewish homeland in there, but the second part was that the local people shouldn't suffer, or words to that effect. The second part has tended to be lost in the mist of time. Trump, for his part, 100 years later, rather nicely in those terms, has decided unilaterally to cancel, if you like, the principal items that would have been, and indeed have been, in the moves towards a peace settlement between two groups in the Holy Land, the Israelis and the Palestinians. Who are they? More about that in a minute. The first, I think, essential point, again, is a historical one. Am I coming across all right? I've got a sense of boom.
Quite loud, isn't it? Can anybody turn
It's
it
turning down.
In fact, do I need it quite so loud? Can you hear me?
Well, there's a little hum, little background hum from the...
Let's try turning it off, because Brian's got a good voice.
Yeah. Okay. The main starting point I want to make that is this. When the Israel-Palestine in its conflict, in its modern form, began in 1948-49. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes. All right. It was seen at that time as a conflict, roughly speaking, between two groups roughly equal in the early years of the Israeli state. The Israeli side, Israeli Defense Force, and so on, were roughly comparable with the Jordanian Arab Legion, which was fighting for the Palestinians in the West Bank, and one began to talk about two groups needing to compromise. Well, the first compromise was, of course, the truce settlement in 1949, which was the basis of the territorial division between the two parts of the Holy Land. By Holy Land, what I'm talking about is, if you look at this sketch map on the second page of this handout, I'm talking about the coloured bits, excluding the bit called Golan. The coloured bits constitute what the other coloured bits constitute what we could call the Holy Land, or British Mandate Palestine, or the Ottoman province of Palestine, whatever you like. It consisted after 49 of an Israel expanded substantially beyond what the United Nations had proposed for it, and it consisted of all of that, plus the remnant of the Mandate Palestine, the old Palestine, consisting now of the occupied territories. So if I talk about Israel, for the purposes of this evening, I'm going to talk about that yellow area on the map, which is the UN proposed Israel plus about 20% of Palestine, which the Israelis managed to take control of during the conflict in 1948-49. The remaining bits, occupied Palestinian territories, consist of three parts, and the distinction is important. The main part is the West Bank, which is the bit with the, on the east side of the Israeli state. The east of Jerusalem is the second part of the occupied territories, the eastern part of the city, the part of Jerusalem which the Arab Legion managed to hold on to in 1949. And the third part is the little Gaza Strip, as it's called, down in the corner on the border with Egypt. These three parts together constitute the OPT, or the Occupied Palestinian Territories. The point I want to build at this moment is that the relationship between the two contestants in this conflict have changed dramatically and significantly. For many decades, there was reasonably enough the feeling that if we get the Israelis together with the Palestinians, we can have a compromise which might be based on a two-state solution in which the Israelis might keep what they have got after 1949 and leave the Palestinians to have the occupied territories, including perhaps a Palestinian capital in the city of Jerusalem, so that you might have had both an Israeli capital and a Palestinian capital within the holy city of Jerusalem. This idea carried on, one can say, until relatively recently, when it became clear that on the Israeli side, the imbalance between the two groups was becoming perceptible. It was possible to continue to say, look, we've got a family of Israelis talking to a family of Palestinians. Isn't that encouraging? We had the internationally renowned musician, Daniel Barenboim, very great friends with Palestinian Christian Edwin Said. And people said, isn't this wonderful? It shows you that educated Israelis and Palestinians can get together, and all the rest of it. So there was hope that there could have been a compromise. The point I want to start with, which is my assessment, which not my original assessment, I've pinched it from other people whose assessment it was, is that the ball game has changed now. We now have an extraordinarily powerful Israel. We have an Israel which is reckoned to be seventh, perhaps, military power in the world. We're talking big time. We're talking of an Israel which is technologically very advanced, and above all, it has, under President Trump, it has unquestioning support of the world's superpower. Those factors put it in a position of strength which it hitherto did not have, right up until the Obama administration, and certainly in some of the previous administrations. I'm thinking particularly of President Carter and Bush Sr. There were presidents who said, hey, you guys, why don't we have a bit of less US support and a bit more Israeli compromise? Under Trump, that has all gone. Trump has taken the agenda, if you like, of what have been now for some years, the agenda of peace talks. The same old items have come up in one peace talk situation after another. The status of Jerusalem. Can it be the capital of both political entities, Palestine, a small Palestine, and Israel? What about the refugees? Refugees in this context refer to Palestinians who are not in the Holy Land. They are about 4 or 5 million of them. Your taxes and mine are keeping them alive in other countries, notably Jordan, Syria, other surrounding areas. Should they be given compensation? Normally, people have said, even Israelis, have said, oh yes, we'll give them compensation, but we don't want them back again, because this would upset the demographic balance, which I shall comment on at length in a moment. But there are other factors as well. The nature of what would have been the Palestinian state. Nobody ever questioned that Israel was a state, since it was admitted to the UN after it was established. And people said, well, perhaps there could be a Palestinian state admitted to the UN. Indeed, it has been admitted as an observer, and it sits next to the representatives of the Vatican and the Order of Knights Hospitaller of Jerusalem in the UN as an observer group. And so it has that limited status. So this was another factor in the original agenda, which is now gone, because President Trump has now done pretty much everything to unilaterally, this is the point, like a poker player, giving away all his top cards for no return whatever. This is the main criticism that many Israelis, as well as most Palestinians, are levelling at him, that he has changed the nature of the conflict. It is no longer an Israel-Palestine conflict. It is a situation in which there is one inevitable outcome, one political outcome for the whole of the Holy Land. The talk of a two-state solution is now a meaningless mantra, and this is what I want to leave you with to take home to think about. You'll go home and you'll look on the internet, what is the UK policy on Holy Land conflict between Israelis and Palestinians? Oh, say the UK government, we maintain that there must be talk, there must be discussion, and there must be a two-state solution. This is rubbish. It is impossible because, as I said, Trump has removed the bases upon which such a compromise could have been achieved. Let me turn a little bit now to the reaction on the Israeli side to what has happened, or to Israelis. The first thing to mention here, of course, is that the Israeli population, often thought of as Jewish, is 1/5 not to Druze and other minority religious sects. But it's often overlooked that 1/5 of the population with citizenship, I'm talking about, living in Israel, in the yellow part of the map, they are not Jewish. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because of the demographic factor. Now, what is this demographic factor? Let me go back to the proposition, and we can debate what you think about it later, that the two-state solution is dead. It is a non-starter. There is going to be a one-something sort of solution, and inevitably that one-something solution is going to be Israel-led. The Palestinians will have no say directly in what happens. The decisions are up to Israel. Palestine, which once upon a time had powerful friends in the Arab world, Arab Legion I touched on, were able to rescue the West Bank from occupation by Israel in 1949, although not in 1967. But the Arab world has fallen away from its support for Palestinians insofar as Arab governments are concerned. We now have what we might think to be a paradoxical situation in which one of Israel's closest political allies is Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia, at the early stage of Israel state's revolution, was its most vociferous opponent, galvanizing position and paying armies and terrorists and freedom fighters to attack Israel. This paradoxical situation now has Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and other countries siding with Israel against Iran. You've guessed it. Trump, for his part, has listened so long and so hard to Netanyahu that he now believes that Iran must be neutralized as a potential threat to Israel. It's the fifth and final military threat to Israel as a state. What are the other four? Egypt and Jordan were neutralized, if you can use that word, as opponents of Israel in 1979 at the Camp David Agreement, as a result of which they signed peace treaties with Israel and have been more or less at peace, indeed at government level, since 1979, and received huge amounts of money from the United States. Cynics would say to keep them quiet and stop them being unfriendly towards Israel. That may be a bit unfair. Iraq was the third country and was removed from the list of potential threats to Israel, military threats, in 2003, as you very well know, by Bush Jr. This left Syria and Iran. Syria is a complicated case. You could say it's destroying itself as a threat to Israel, although even as we speak, Israeli planes and Syrian planes are attacking each other, and they're bombing, Israelis are bombing Iranian targets within Syria. So there's a complication there. But Iran, the non-Arab enemy, remains vociferously opposed to what has happened to the Palestinians, basically. So is seen as a big threat to Israel. Iran's power is growing in the Middle East now because of the collapse of Iraq, destroyed by Britain and America. Because Iraq previously had been a kind of bulwark between the Sunni-led Arab side of the Middle East and the Shia-led Iranian side of the Middle East. So now we have Iran moving into Iraq and directly confronting Saudi Arabia. So my point at this stage is that at a governmental level, the Israeli state is no longer threatened, except from Iran, by Arab governments. There may be bellicose comments also from non-Arab governments, like Turkey, but nevertheless, the threat from government level is gone. Very different situation from 1967, but that was 73. Let's forget that. It's important to emphasize, though, that the attitude of the man and woman in the street in the Arab world has not changed in the way that the attitude of Arab governments has changed. Israel is still the slogan that is shouted about, down with Israel, all this kind of thing. The Palestinians must be remembered as martyrs, etc., etc., etc. So it's important to put the present situation in this Middle Eastern context, because it's quite remarkable what has happened. So, getting back to the Israeli side of the argument, and we don't have too much time to talk about Iran unless we perhaps do later on. What the Israeli policy with regard to the Holy Land now, thanks to Trump and the end of reasonable chance of any face-to-face negotiation between equals, is that Israel is now determined to control the whole of the Holy Land. Occupied territories plus yellow on my map, Israel. There's one caveat here. The Gaza Strip, while politically speaking, is the responsibility of Israel, is said by Israel not to be its responsibility. It has hived it off. it has removed 6,000 Israeli settlers from the Gaza Strip in 2006, moved them to the West Bank for the most part, and has barricaded the Gaza Strip, as you hear from time to time on the television, when the Israelis bomb or invade or shoot protesters who are threatening Israeli snipers on the ceasefire line and the barricaded line around the Gaza Strip. Why has Israel done this? Well, they've done it for demographic reasons. There are 2 million Gazan inhabitants now, most of them refugees from, I don't know, Haifa, Acre, Ashkelon and so on. And they are growing rapidly in number. And they are ruled by a pretty fearsome group known as Hamas, whose policy is non-compromise with the rights of the Palestinians. While the West Bank is ruled by President Assad, who is called by his enemies an accommodationist because he works with the Israelis on a day-to-day basis in policing the West Bank, operating the water system, the electricity system, and so forth. And by his opponents, he's called a traitor because he doesn't stand up for what they would see as Palestinian rights and so on. So we now have an occupied territories which are, in one degree or another, the responsibility of, or occupied or potentially under the control of Israel. Within the West Bank, there's a further and very important complication. There are two. One complication is that the eastern part of Jerusalem, which I mentioned earlier, is, according to the United Nations and everybody else, is still part of the West Bank. According to Israel and the United States now, thanks to President Trump, it is not part of the West Bank, East Jerusalem. It is the Arab part, if you like. It is now part of a unified Jewish plus Arab Jerusalem, which is the capital of Israel. Trump has recognized this, and to support that recognition, has moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv, where all but one of the world's embassies to Israel are located, British embassies in Tel Aviv, moved it to Jerusalem to dramatize this acceptance. Meanwhile, Trump, to back up his switch of policy, has cut off all American funding to Palestinians through the United Nations, through UNRWA, the supporting refugees in the West Bank and elsewhere, but he's also cut off other monies as well. In return, Palestinians, it's not a big deal, have cut off their recognition of the United States as the interlocutor in the conflict between Palestine and Israel. The Americans have closed down the office in East Jerusalem, which was a sort of Palestinian embassy to office in dealing with the United States. All American relations now with the Palestinians will be conducted through the US Embassy in Jerusalem. So we have a very, very, very difficult situation. Let me say a few more things about the West Bank, and then I'll move to a conclusion by talking about the demographic and the geographic elements of this problem, which are going to be the basis of its future outcome. If you look at this sketch map, and it's not a very accurate one, on the second page of this history of the conflict, you can see that the West Bank consists of part of Jerusalem, the eastern bit, that kind of coloured spot, and I've indicated two other colours, a sort of dark green and a rather, I'm not sure what colour that colour is, pale sort of a colour. Those two bits together, that's the West Bank. The reason I've got these dark green patches is because those are the areas around which Israel has built a security barrier or a containment wall, depending on what you want to call it. The idea is that this wall, which is now approaching completion and will be something like 700 kilometers long when it's finished, encircles the majority of Israeli settlements within the occupied West Bank. These settlements are regarded by the United Nations and the wider world, including Britain, as illegal, but the Israelis say they're not illegal because they are part of the right of the Jewish state to have control or access to Judea and Samaria because those are territories which were given by God to Israel as part of their patrimony. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, in a recent statement, he is an evangelical Christian, he made a statement that, in his opinion, God is working to support Israel to get back its God-given rights in Holy Land. This kind of evangelical Protestant view of the conflict is very difficult to deal with because it's very variegated, but it's extraordinarily important, and I'll say a little bit about it. In the early days of the conflict, it was often seen as Jewish Americans supporting the American government, Jewish Europeans, Jewish British people, supporting Israel because of the Holocaust. They have to have a homeland, or because they have suffered pogroms in Tsarist Russia or whatever. For one reason or another, there was a great deal of support for Israel, but it was support for Israelis who were perceived, right enough, to be Jewish. Whereas now, the situation has changed to the extent that in the United States, the bastion of support for Israel within the American political system, still largely dominated, one has to say, by people who feel an affinity with Israel. They feel that Israel is the outcome of God's promise. They feel that it's the only solution to a Europe which produces a Holocaust. But the Jewish support for Israel is fraying at the edges, not collapsing, fraying at the edges. There are an increasing number of quite vociferous American Jewish groups who say that, more or less along the lines of what I'm saying, that if Israel insists on holding the whole of the Holy Land, it cannot remain a Jewish and a democratic state. Not a Jewish state, because Jews would be a minority within the Holy Land, and not a democratic state, because that Jewish element would have to produce a kind of South African-style apartheid government with a minority ruling over the majority. Now, what about these evangelicals? The reason they are important in the United States is because they are vastly more numerous than the Jewish community in the US. There are probably 6 million Jews in the US. There are arguably 20-30 million evangelical Christians, some of whom are messianic evangelical Christians who argue that American support for Israel is essential to facilitate the second coming of Christ. And I have heard some Americans would go as far as to say, that we must prepare the landing grounds. It becomes, to me, unbelievable in the strict sense of the word. But it's real, and these evangelicals vote for Trump. He promised them the sorts of things that have now happened in the Holy Land. He promised them that he would get to grips with the problems with the help of his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and the American ambassador, a vociferous supporter of the present Israel. Now, let me move to the central point of my argument, which is that, of course, Israel has the power to control the whole of the Holy Land. It does already. Given American support and given European disinterest, and even going along with the American view, because all we want to know about the Holy Land is that they do the Eurovision Song Contest, that the situation is developing where there will become an Israeli entity consisting of all the West Bank, all of East Jerusalem, and to some extent Gaza, because of that political strange nature. Now, if this comes about, then, as many Israelis point out, the very nature of the Israeli state is brought into question. The Israeli state is not what it was in 1949. If you were brought up as I was, with pictures of these, hard-working kibbutzniks growing crops on farms on the West Bank, or not the West Bank, in Israel rather, that has all gone. The kibbutzim era has faded. Left-wing Israel is gone, right-wing Israel is now in control. Right-wing Israel argues that the Jewish homeland, for which the whole Zionist movement was set up in the end of the 19th century, the whole Zionist project depends on complete control of the whole of the Holy Land, including the West Bank, which has 2-3 million Palestinians there. We begin to see the demographic problem here. Why so important the West Bank to Israel? It's important, I touched on, for religious historical reasons. And it's important also because it's got water, it's got other resources, and it has the benefit that it gives militarists in Israel a sense of security. It gives security in depth, because Israel is otherwise only 12 miles wide at its middle point. So what we're coming to now, in the Trump era, we're coming to a new situation in which the Israelis are going to have to decide what kind of government they're going to have over a population which will soon, not now, but soon be majority non-Jewish. Now, we assume that Iran is removed from the equation. There will not be a threat. Syria will not be a threat. Syria has lost its Golan Heights, occupied by Israel in 1967, and is not going to be in a position to get them back very soon. So what is Israel going to do? Now, think of yourself as an ordinary Israeli, right? You would like to live, if you're a secular Israeli, you'd like to live in the Holy Land, you'd like to live in Israel because you always wanted to, and that's why you came there from Brooklyn or Wandsworth, or the Middle East, or Iraq, or wherever you came from. If, on the other hand, you are one of the fifth of Israelis who are Orthodox Israelis, you may decide that you don't want that kind of Israel. You want a very, very devout, theological kind of Israel in which the law of the country is resolutely the law of the Torah, the law of the Judaism. Now, at the beginning of Israel, some Israelis say a mistake was made. It was decided to allow Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Israeli Jews a number of benefits: no military service, tax remission, all kinds of other benefits, provided they spent their time thinking about religion, reading holy books. And at that time, you've got to visualize 1949, a shattered population coming from Europe, fleeing European persecution. Holocaust was not long in the past. They came there, and here were people who were willing to revive the language, revive Judaism as a national institution within the country. So they were given these privileges. Fine, because there were at that time a few hundred of them. They now constitute a couple of million, and they are beginning to get into a conflict situation within Israel between the secular, let's call them the Tel Aviv Israelis. So you've got the Jerusalem Israelis versus the secular Israelis, the Tel Aviv ones. Alongside both of those, you've got your Arab, Muslim, Christian Israelis who are feeling themselves now to be like a rock between a stone and a hard place. They're caught there. They are particularly worried at the moment because one Israeli move last year was to institute under Netanyahu a law which said that Israel is the state of the Jewish people. Arabic will be demoted as a national language, and non-Jewish people, while citizens of Israel, will not be equal to Jewish citizens of Israel. Arab citizens who have the vote, they don't do military service, but they pay taxes and are well looked after, they are very, very threatened by this. So we have a situation of great internal concern on the Israeli side. Finally, we have a situation of even more internal concern on the OPT, the Occupied Territory side. I've touched on this. In the West Bank, we have an administration which, as it were, put it crudely, goes along with the occupation in order to get water, in order to get electricity. It feels it has to because the situation is desperate economically. In Gaza, the situation is worse. The United Nations has said recently that the Gaza Strip, within a very short period of time, is likely to become uninhabitable because sewage is rising up into the surface water, groundwater areas, and illness and that sort of thing is spreading, to say nothing of 70–75% unemployment rates and all the rest of it, not to mention the barricade and the bombing and so on and so forth, for which, for their part, Hamas is attempting to see it, to fly the flag of resolute Palestine, Palestine which demands redress for the loss of 96% of their territory, kind of thing. So, and even within the West Bank, there is, of course, conflict on the Palestinian side. There are those Palestinians who are doing relatively well, have got homes and perhaps businesses, some of which are not doing badly at all. And there are those Palestinians on the West Bank who live in refugee camps or are otherwise pretty miserably off. So there are, what I want to stress, there are conflicts within the Palestinian side, conflicts between different members of the groups within the Israeli side. All this is happening at a time when we have to expect that within perhaps 2, 3, 4, 5 years, the Israeli electorate is going to face what to do about millions, 13 million people, who are involved. Israel has about 8 million, as I've said, a fifth of whom are Arabs. Altogether, the Holy Land is about 13 million, then there are more Palestinians outside. Then what is going to happen? The reason why at the beginning I touched on the international importance of this is because while Arab governments may be cozying up to Netanyahu's extreme right-wing administration, the ordinary people in the Middle East are not. And this is where you get some of the breeding ground we hear about for anti-Western anger and terrorism and so on and so forth. So the situation is not likely to get better very soon. Finally, the optimistic hope of Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of the president, is that a conference which he is going to organise in 6 days' time in Bahrain, in the Gulf, this is a conference which is going to bring together the opportunity for President Trump's grand plan for the Holy Land to be set out. What this grand plan looks like at the moment, it involves Arab governments, including Jordan and Egypt, not the Palestinians. It involves the Israelis and the United States. This grand plan, to put it into a nutshell, seems to involve President Trump saying to these Arab governments, if you and we, the US, can produce enough billions of dollars, can we buy off the Palestine resistance? In the sense that, can we get President Abbas to agree to abandon the notion of a separate Palestinian state, except instead to have the notion of some kind of quasi-autonomous status within a greater Israel, and accept billions, and we're talking big billions, so that there's talk of a huge port for the Palestinians, airport, and this, that, and the other. Can the Palestinians be bought off? They're not at the negotiations, so it'll be interesting to see. Some people think the meeting will not happen, but it's scheduled for the 25th and 26th, so it's a case of watch this space. If it doesn't happen, Trump won't give up on his plan, and I've talked far too long to shut up. So, pardon?
Don't feel you have to stop.
Well, I should stop now, and perhaps I have a break and a few questions.
Discussion.
Yes, but I have put these thoughts of mine on this second piece of paper, and you'll be very welcome to take it home and see what you think about it. And then we can have some questions after the break.
Certainly. So let's have about 5–10 minutes to an incredibly powerful committee in the States called the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which I gather it's almost impossible to get into Congress if they don't support you. Anyway, could you tell us a little bit about them, Brian? How powerful are they and how do they work?
The AIPAC, as it's often called, is an important part of the reality of the United States support for Israel. When I lived in the United States, I emigrated there, lived many years, it became obvious at election time that AIPAC would want to know the views of candidates about US support for Israel, rather more than any other country, except for Britain and other European ones. AIPAC is, as Tricia said, it's a lobby. It's probably, most people would agree, I think, that it's second only to the National Rifle Association. in its power because of the way it can influence the election of particularly Congress people, but also senators to some extent. It's organised across the country, and it has grassroots representation. I remember in my university in Ohio, if there were a meeting like this on any subject to do with Israel, Middle East Israel, something or other, there would almost certainly be somebody in the room who could be identified one way or another as the local AIPAC rep who would want to find out which academics were saying what about the Middle East. So it was power on the ground. On the other hand, I think it's fair to say that it's the right of a country to have lobby groups. People don't have lobby groups. I don't blame AIPAC. They believe that they should support Israel without question. What Israel does is right. If Israeli snipers kill teenagers throwing stones across the border with Gaza, then that's because those teenagers shouldn't be throwing the stones. And that's how they see it. I don't see it quite like that, but that's how they do. And over the decades, AIPAC has, I think most people would agree, has developed a feeling within the United States public that Israel is rather like the wagons surrounded by the Apaches. They're there, they've got to be helped. They're a bridgehead, in one sense they are, but they're not a weak bridgehead anymore. They are the most powerful country in the Middle East, and that's what's changed. But AIPAC hasn't changed. But what has changed are the people who are opposed to AIPAC, small groups that I mentioned, Americans for Peace in the Middle East, and several others. J Street is a Zionist organization. It supports Israel. It supports aid to Israel, but it says not in what Israel is doing now. We don't like the move towards the one-entity solution. So Israeli criticism is growing, but if I may put it this way, I think a great deal of support for AIPAC is on the part of the Jewish population who really don't know much about what is going on the ground. They perhaps were victims of Nazism, they've gone to America, so anything pro-Israel must be good. Even if many Israelis are saying it's not good. It's not good shooting teenagers who throw stones with rifles. We shouldn't be doing that, say many Israeli Jews. Whereas, you see, it's a complicated position, but it's a powerful one. It's the most powerful apart from National Rifle Association.
Thank you. Yes, Jim.
Okay. Hi, my name's Jeff Herman. I'm a British citizen and an American citizen.
Yes.
I recently came back from Israel, where I spent 2 weeks.
Oh, good.
I wanted to make a comment about my experience while I was there, which touches on two things you mentioned. One was you earlier said that there's no government supporting the Palestinians at that time. At this time, and I want to say that's not quite right. And the other is, I want to respond to the idea of Israeli soldiers shooting teenagers.
Yes.
Because when I arrived in early May, it was coincident with the launching of 700 rockets by Hamas from the Gaza Strip into civilian population centers of Israel, in which they randomly murdered 3 Israelis and injured several others. And that happened to be just before Independence Day and Memorial Day, and that was coincident with my arrival. So I heard a lot from Israelis about how they reacted to that situation. The reason why the 700 rockets were launched into the civilian areas on that occasion was, and it became clear, and it's been reported in international media, and it became clear through other sources, the Ramadan was about to start. Hamas had not been able to pay salaries for several months. The Qataris, and this is the government that still supports the Palestinians, the Qataris have been funding Hamas for a number of years. And the Qataris had a shipment of cash ready to be shipped to Hamas's people so they could pay salaries so they could have a lovely Ramadan. And the Hamas representatives who were negotiating in Egypt to try to get a lifting of the embargo on the Gaza Strip told the Egyptian intermediaries, who then report to the Israelis, because the Israelis won't talk directly to Hamas. They told the Egyptian intermediaries, we'll stop launching the rockets if you let the Qatari ship with the cash for our people's salaries to arrive. The Israelis allowed the ship to arrive, the rockets stopped. So what you had was an instance where purely to get money to enjoy a celebration of religious holiday, 700 rockets were launched willy-nilly into population centers and resulted in random murders of Israelis. In response, the Israelis did use more force than was launched at them, you might say, but it's more targeted. And that is the Israeli military attacked. They tried to attack identified military targets, and unfortunately there were civilian Palestinians who suffered as well as collateral damage. That's my observation of what the current situation was vis-a-vis the conflict and the support for Palestinians at this time.
Sounds very accurate to me on that point. Yes. I'll just comment a little bit further on Hamas. Hamas is credited, rightly, with being a pretty dictatorial regime with a fairly stern Islamist outlook on life. But I have some support for the idea that it's not in complete control of Gaza. I believe that some of the Hamas assertions that they were not responsible for some of these attacks are probably true. Some of them might have been. It's a difficult position. What do you do about it? What you've said is absolutely right. It's going to get worse. There will be these occasional outbursts of what we call war, in which you have huge numbers of Palestinian casualties and substantial numbers of Israeli. One of the conflicts some years ago, the kill ratio was 100 to 1. Now, many Israelis would argue that we can't have a democratic Jewish state if we're involved in this kind of treatment of another people. There's got to be a resolution. For what it's worth, and I'm not an Israeli politician, I think it will be necessary for Israel either to reoccupy Gaza and treat it as a part of the West Bank, so give the people who live in Gaza the same kind of help and support with electricity, water, that is given to people in West Bank, or to cede it to Egypt. This is one of the latest proposals, indeed, from some Israelis. If we cede Gaza to Egypt and make it bigger by giving it a little chunk of Egyptian Sinai desert, then 2, 3, 4 million Palestinians could live there, and they would not be counted on the demographic balance for Israel, which would help the position of the Jews versus non-Jews in the Holy Land. But yes, I have no argument. What you say, it sounds very interesting. It taught me something, some details there. And all I would say is this the kind of perpetual future we want for Israelis or Palestinians in the Middle East? Some solution has got to happen. Trump has got a solution. Not happened yet, but he's proposed one. Some Israelis agree that the idea of the one-state solution should be good. Some Israelis have said we should abandon the idea of a Jewish state. We should have a democratic state in which there could be religious, dare I use the word in this room, religious cantons. You can be a citizen, a member of the Jewish group, a member of the Christian group, or the Shia group, or whatever group, a kind of religious Switzerland, in which you had a sort of religious federation. Other Israelis say no, because they don't perhaps trust the non-Jewish elements, or for whatever reason. But I suppose I come back to my basic point that the present situation is something was Churchill set up with which we cannot put. It's hopeless. But thanks for your comment. They're very good. Hamas is not well understood, I feel. Yes.
If I may add to the comment made by the gentleman here, the territory of Gaza was given back, using an appropriate word, I suppose, in 2007 to an element of the Palestinian people.
Oh, Gaza, sorry, yes.
Yes. What then emerged was a theocracy which was very much backed by the likes of Iran, as you probably know,
yeah.
who are being supported by Hezbollah in Lebanon, who are trying to ship arms into Gaza. But you mentioned that some of the rockets being fired without the knowledge of Hamas. There is a group called Islamic Jihad, who are quite autonomous in many ways. The problem we have with Hamas is that they have had billions of dollars poured into Gaza. A lot of that money is poured into their back pockets. The plight of the people is down purely to the selfishness and arrogance of Hamas, who don't care tucks for their people. But in the meanwhile, in Gaza City, you have a 7-star hotel, you have a top-of-the-notch shopping centre with escalators and air conditioning and everything, while the rest of the people are struggling just to feed themselves. So the problem is not what is proverbially called the occupation of Hamas, of Gaza. The problem is that Hamas has created this situation for their own selfishness while ignoring its people.
You put that position very clearly, but are you going to blame Hamas for, well, hold on, let me just finish here. Are you going to blame Hamas for the women who lose babies at checkpoints because they can't get through to Israel?
I have heard so many stories about this. The biggest problem that Israel has with transition of people going in and out of Hamas to seek medical treatment is whether they are genuine or not. And what's happened is there's been a pattern of people begging for help for their medical conditions, where it's transpired that they are actually trying to smuggle something quite volatile through the border.
Yes, true enough.
What is overlooked very often is that when people from Gaza come to Israel for treatment, they are treated as equally as anybody else.
Yes. Even from Syria.
Well, I was about to say the terrible war in Syria, towards the end of that conflict, which is now, thank God, almost over 3,500 Syrians crept through via the Golan Heights, thank God for the Golan Heights, to come to Israel, where they were treated for their war injuries through a field hospital.
True.
No money was taken. So there's a lot to be said for what now exists in the Middle East as the state of Israel. It's a question that if there's a one-state solution, would that then create an Arab majority and therefore create from there a Jewish refugee problem?
Yes. Well, that's what I was really thinking is in the minds of some Israelis, yes. But most Israelis think that their power and their American support is enough for them to be able to avoid that. Now, you touched on Iran. Let me just mention very briefly. I didn't want to spend too much time on that. Iran and Hamas. Interesting. Iran, the leading Shia power in the world, very anxious to get into Syria, which it is, very anxious to get to the Mediterranean and establish its influence vis-à-vis Saudi Arabia, its arch rival. But you're correct. Iran is doing its best to help Hamas, which is a bit strange insofar as the Hamas people are almost to a man or woman Sunnis, and this is a bedfellows by convenience rather than by love. Equally, Hezbollah, who are doing their best to build up their power for the next war with Israel, are supporting Hamas because Hamas is at the other end of Israel and there's a bit of an alternative target for Israelis, etc. But they, of course, are Shia, and they are big allies of Iran. So all this says is that, you know, your enemy's enemy is your friend, and your friend's enemy is your enemy, and you join up with people according to what you will. Now, the best example of this has got to be Israel and Saudi Arabia agreeing that they want to neutralize, as they put it, Iran. I mean, 30 years ago this would have been preposterous. Everything.
30 years ago, you have a problem.
Yeah. What I don't want to leave you with, what I don't want to leave you with is a feeling that in this conflict, after all these decades, that the conflict is going to be resolved by a sort of balancing account of the nasty things done by the Palestinians versus the nasty things done by the Israelis, The Palestinians have done more nasty things, and fewer Israelis have done nasty things. Therefore, the Israelis are somehow right. It doesn't work like that. The Israelis can be as nice as they like. They can help as many Syrian soldiers as they like. This doesn't alter the threat to Israel. This is what I'm trying to get at. There's a threat there. That if I were an Israeli, a zealot, especially if I were an Orthodox Israeli, as many do, I would say, look guys, we're heading for disaster. We're heading for civil war within Israel. Now, don't you get my point?
I'm just giving a follow-up question and then I'll come to you. Because you talked about how if it becomes one state, you're going to have these Palestinians who maybe it'll be an apartheid situation, that they will have fewer rights. But my understanding is that already now, Palestinians living in Israel proper don't have the same rights as Jewish Israelis.
No, they don't.
They have a smaller ration of water, they have less access to various benefits. You mentioned they don't do military service, that's one.
Sure, water. In most material respects, Palestinians who are Israeli subjects are well off.
Right.
They reckon, somebody reckoned recently, I can't remember who, that Israeli Palestinians are on average about 6 times as wealthy as occupied territory Palestinians. But they are now worried because of this new legislation and because of some of its implications. Just one implication that worries some Israeli Arabs is the fact that an Israeli Arab, an Arab with Israeli citizenship, who marries an Arab without Israeli citizenship, say from Gaza, cannot bring that spouse into Israel because the Israelis, rightly enough, fear that there will then be a family of 10 young Palestinians who are Israeli citizens that they don't need to have. So there are all kinds of problems when you start monkeying around in this borderline area between nationality and religiosity and religious identity. It ultimately comes down to this basic question. What kind of an Israel do you want? Do you want the kind of Israel where non-Orthodox Jews are prohibited from getting on a bus on the Sabbath? Many people in Tel Aviv will be very angry if you told them you mustn't get on a bus on the Sabbath. You take my point. We are so used to seeing this as an Israel-Palestine conflict. But one of the things I'm trying to leave you with is the thought that there are now 2 conflicts going on. What kind of Israel is going to happen, and how can the 2 bits of Palestine ever get together again, because they are so far apart? So you've got 2 subsidiary conflicts within the wider one, and the wider one sits within the Middle East, where you've got outside powers meddling in one way or another. And so,
and the secret nuclear bombs sort of in the middle of it somewhere.
Well, the Israelis won't use a bomb, don't they? But the Israelis won't use their nuclear bombs unless they're attacked. It would be foolish. If Israel is attacked with a nuclear bomb, there's not much Israel left.
The irony, since Hiroshima, no nuclear weapons have ever been used.
Right.
Yeah. Well, let's leave with that hope.
Yes, thank you.
First of all, I'd like to take words of the late President Nelson Mandela, that publicly stated that Hamas was formed backed by the U.S. government and the Tel Aviv government with the object to divide the Palestinian people.
Yeah, this is a well-known argument.
The Middle East is a mishmash that's going on. There's deals within deals, and unfortunately, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed and are being killed. Going back to Gaza City is besieged by land, sea, and air, and under international law, they have a right to defend themselves. I would also like to state, personally, I'm opposed to a war or aggression, regardless of which country, which organization, it doesn't matter. However, that's the situation in in Gaza City. You can compare that with Leningrad, which was surrounded by the German forces, the Wehrmacht, etc., these people had a right to defend their city. So the people in Gaza City has a right. And for this gentleman here to say that the Israelis were attacking military targets in Gaza is total propaganda, because they bombed and killed civilians left, right, and center. Even one of the top, I think he stood as vice president or beside Netanyahu, said he had no problem with killing Arabs and killing them on. This is a sort of, unfortunately, leadership that you get there, which promotes war and so on.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Can I since my capacity has been
Let
challenged,
me just finish.
Yeah, possibly. So there's a lot of interest now. The Israelis put on a 3-kilometer limit on the fishing people from Gaza. Their reason was for the defense of Israel, but actually it was because they didn't want the people in Gaza to exploit the gas, which is just offshore Gaza City. Now, further out to sea, the Israeli government is exploiting this gas, and it's being sold to Shell, which is a Dutch royal family who have bought British gas. So this is just one of the backgrounds that's going on all the time. War is evil. War is big business. And if you follow the money trail, you see where it all leads.
Right, thank you.
So, yeah, so I'm not...
Just let me see, sorry, do you have a comment on that? Or
Yes, I hear what you say, big business and all the rest of it, but we can't go on into the future just accepting all this as a kind of great reality. We've got to see whether there can be some kind of semi-peaceful, fairly peaceful, largely peaceful solution to this problem in the Holy Land. If there isn't, we're looking forward to thousands of people, perhaps tens of thousands of Palestinians, just a few thousand Israelis. It doesn't matter how many, to make my point. And the Middle East is going to be infected by this Holy Land problem that Britain started in 1917 by this double-faced, two-sided argument, this Balfour Declaration, which promised, quote, the rights and privileges of the non-Jewish population of Palestine shall be respected. That got into the declaration because of the Jewish member of the British cabinet who was terrified at the prospect of an Israeli state, Lord Montagu. Anyway.
So, and I just want to mention, to follow up to Brian before I come to the next question, I think we do this as well as learning about the present situation and of course the past, to try and look forward a bit. I mean, I was just appalled when I was in the West Bank to find, you've got the 4th generation of families living in refugee camps. It just seems terrible that these people should still be living endlessly hassled, endlessly persecuted, not having full rights. They're stateless, they have to have year passes from Jordan. So many problems there that I think we do need to try and look forward, and it's very helpful, hearing about Trump and Netanyahu's plan and which bits of it might be viable. I said I'd go to Jeff next, and I'll come to you.
Thank you, because I'm a little bit insulted that it was suggested I'm advancing propaganda here. I am a humanist, and I am appalled by the death of any innocent people, and that includes any race, religion, ethnic group, or whatever. But it is a fact that Hamas rather cynically launches its rockets from the courtyards of apartment blocks. I've seen that on video with my own eyes. It is a fact that they often put a military command post in a school or a hospital, so that if Israel attempts to attack the command post that's launching the rockets, there is collateral damage. I regret that there is collateral damage.
So we're not denying
but these are facts and not propaganda.
No, and we're not denying it, but as Brian mentioned, the ratio of deaths has sometimes been as 100 Palestinians to 1 Israel. It's not an equal death rate.
Okay, yes. Israel, there wouldn't be that problem.
Well, yes, there would. Okay, let me have your, yes.
Looking forward, can you tell us a little bit more about, more detail about this Jared Kushner deal? Like, for instance, how many people are we talking about buying off You said it was billions, but how many, what's the size of the...
I'm not quite clear, and the plan is very, very vague at the moment. Some people think there won't be a meeting. Palestinians are not going to it, but other key people are. How much is involved is not quite clear. I saw one press report talking about something like $75 billion of big, big money. And who's he going to? That's a good question.
Yes.
There are in the world today probably 13, 14 million Palestinians, about twice as many as there are Israeli Jews. And where are they? Some of them are Israeli citizens. Some of them are in Gaza, 2 million we just talked about. 3, 4 million are on the West Bank. Some of them are ordinary citizens, some are in refugee camps. Some are in East Jerusalem, who are living in Israel according to Israel, but have non-citizenship papers, etc. Some are in refugee camps in Jordan and in other parts of the Middle East. Many, many, many are Jordanians. Half the population of Jordan are Palestinians. You know, they're spread out. Now, your question is, to whom is all this largesse going to go? Well, it's going to go to the ones, as I read it, who can do something to get the Palestinians to shut up and stop demanding a state. There's no reference to any of this money going to the refugees who are not in Holy Land.
Is it going towards propaganda?
No, it's not propaganda, no. The idea is that one of the things that the Palestinians will give up is the right of return to their homes of Palestinians who are not in the Holy Land. You've got that. The map is important. They're not in the West Bank, they're not in Israel, they're in somewhere like Jordan. They will give up their rights.
They get some money.
They may or may not get money. They could do that, but I haven't figured out yet.
Is this like some kind of post-compulsory purchase order? You know?
But look at it. Let's look at it on the bright side. What it is an attempt to, and a vitally important attempt, I think, to improve the lot of Palestinians who live in the Holy Land by giving them the prospect of employment, hospitals, a port. Not quite sure where the port's going to be, because if the port is in Gaza, then it's not in the West Bank. Anyway, that's a little detail that Trump probably isn't aware of, because he may not have looked at the map. And so I'm being a bit cynical there.
And you know, you have a real estate developer who's the son of a real estate developer,
yes.
And his solution is real estate development.
It is. Well, so Kushner is a real estate man as well.
Yes, no, that's what I'm talking about, Kushner. I'm not talking about Trump, I'm talking about Kushner.
Yeah.
He's a real estate developer's son who's himself a real estate developer, and his idea is we'll bring together a bunch of money and we'll develop real estate. And they'll be so happy for the economic consequences of this that they'll give up any political demands. That's the idea.
I've commented. Thank you. Yes. Yes.
It hasn't happened yet.
Thank you very much for your talk. I want to ask you two things actually. The first one is I've been to Israel a couple of times, and the thing I used to be a school teacher and I used to take this on trips now as well as teaching. What I always noticed was how the River Jordan, the whole thing's about water there ultimately, isn't it? And how on one side you had the Israeli side of where the River Jordan was, and it was all growing stuff for Marks and Spencers and lovely lemons and grapefruits, and on the other side, dust bowl, and that really sums it up the way that they're treating the Palestinians. But the other thing I wanted to ask is something, it's a little bit different. It's this so-called religious thing which is going on there. And you touched on this business of the American fundamentalists,
yes,
who are very Old Testament oriented.
Absolutely.
Now, we've only had Judaism for the last 4,000 years, and really, if you look at it rationally, the three religions themselves, Judaism has been a curse on this world.
What?
Christianity has been an absolute Christianity, which was taken over by the Jewish religion, and then Islam, which is another extension. They all worship the same God, and it's only been here for 4,000 years. and there's only one group of people who actually addressed that problem, and that was the Gnostic Christians of the first couple of 100 years. And
sorry, address which problem? What's the problem you're having?
Yeah, and if we, you see, these are the things that people never talk about, you know, like, you know, because who is this religion? Who is this God that these people are supposed to be following? Who is this Yahweh? You know, who is this Allah? Who are these beings? You know, they are most certainly not beneficial. And it starts off with the, you know, it basically starts off with the Jewish. Then they take over the Christian version, and it becomes you know, the Jewish history.
Could we?
And then you have.
Give me a chance.
Okay, let's hear a comment here. Yes.
With all respect, I haven't addressed a humanist group before, but I'm interested to hear your comment. I think it's got absolutely nothing whatever to do with the problem we're talking about. The people in Jews and Palestinians, they don't go around every day thinking, oh, here comes a rocket from Hamas, I must decide whether I'm a Gnostic or this kind of Jew or that kind of Jew. Or some chap is firing into Gaza Strip, they don't worry about Abraham and the teachings of religion. They're thinking of day-to-day existence as people in a country, both the Israelis and different sorts of Palestinians. So, as I say, I'm not sure that Gnosticism is on my agenda.
What I'm talking about is something really radical about what is the purpose of existence on this planet. Who owns this planet? Why are we on this planet?
I'll come back another time and talk about
that. Nothing about people being, you know, there's been one moment on this planet and there's been someone with their back bent and there's someone with a big stick over them. Yes. Not one moment on this planet. And it's all ruled by this thing called a religion.
No, it's not.
It's an interesting comment, but I think we are where we are now, and what we're trying to discuss tonight is possible ways forward. But I agree, this is something we could discuss another time, the role of religion in the world, but it's not what we're trying to focus on. It's too big a topic for tonight. We are where we are, and we're thinking a bit about how we got here, because obviously that affects it, the various agreements going back to the Balfour Declaration, but maybe about the way forward. Yes, you have a question.
Well, just prompted by the last speaker, I am an atheist, so I do not believe in God of any religion. I don't even like the term the Holy Land.
No, I had to find a general one.
I agree with the previous speaker only as much as he's saying that it's one of the errors of humanity that it does need a God to give them morality and give them, tell them what to do, when obviously the whole thing has been invented by different human groups. By humans. But I think it's a pity that Israel didn't become a secular state. But going back to
it is a secular state. After 1948, it was made a secular state.
Well, yes, apart from the change, the things that the speaker talked about. Now, back in 1947, the United Nations did offer, both recognise that there were Jews in Arab nation, I call them, rather than religions, because I can understand the notion of a nation or a national group. It offered the Jews and Arabs to chop the area of Ottoman Palestine into two bits, and the Israelis accepted their bit and established their state. The Palestinians did not accept their bit. They said, if we can't have a whole lot, we'll have nothing. So they've got nothing for the last 70 years. Now I think that is really, in my opinion, one of the roots of the problems. The Palestinians have to accept that Israel does exist, because unless they do accept that, there's no chance for a two-state solution. I still believe, although the speaker gave reasons why it's dead, I still think it's the only logical solution. But in order to get Israel to withdraw, obviously it's present ultra-right-wing government, one can disagree with them, that's in government, but there have been more reasonable Labour movements in Israel in the past. But even they wouldn't accept withdrawing from the West Bank, in my opinion, unless they thought all the Arab states would recognise Israel, not immediately move in and start to demolish it. So I think Hamas has got to make a statement that it does accept the Israeli state and hope for, then there's some chance that the Palestinians will get their own state. That's my opinion on the subject.
Okay, well, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, this business of recognition of Israeli state is a common one that pops up. The current position in the Middle East, I think one could put it this way, is that a Saudi-led proposal some years ago was that the Arab League, or the Arab world in general, would accept an Israeli state. This is before we got up to my time with all this one state idea, when we were talking two states. The Saudis led a proposal to recognize Israel if it withdrew to the ceasefire lines on the yellow map. If it withdrew to the yellow map, those ceasefire lines of 1949, possibly with minor rectifications, moving the border here and there, that sort of thing. That is the current Arab League position. As regards Hamas, Hamas gets bad press on this when it's supposed to be throwing Israelis into the sea. It has in the past come out with the most gory rhetoric about what it wanted to do. Hamas' current position is that they recognise the situation as it now is and would accept for the foreseeable future the same boundaries that Israel has got now, provided as a withdrawal to the yellow area on my map. The difference between Hamas and the Saudi plan is that the Saudi plan is a definitive one. It will happen now, we'll do it, go home tomorrow, Arab capital in East Jerusalem and so on. Saudi plan is vaguer. One has to, no, absolutely vaguer. And they're probably making it vaguer for the reasons of their own. But yes, it's a problem. But the Hamas, however strong they may be militarily on the ground, are not the same as the whole of the Arab League. The problem is the failure of the West, failure of America, failure of Israel to accept the Arab League proposal, which would have brought my yellow Israel into being. Israelis don't accept it, let me put it this way, because they don't need to. They don't have to. They are so powerful, they could occupy half of Lebanon and Jordan as well. They don't have to retreat. Why should they retreat? And lose the West Bank, lose its water, lose access to the religious settlements there? Why should they retreat from East Jerusalem and give up the walled city and all of that? Why should they leave Syrian Golan Heights when it's very useful to them for security purposes and so on? They don't have to. So in the past we used to talk about the two states getting together and a kind of compromise. Compromise is finito. This is my main point. That we've got a one-sided situation and we have now to worry about what is going to be the nature of this one-sided, one entity. I avoid calling it state, one entity solution. And talking about, with all respect, Gnosticism and rockets and all the rest of it is not focusing on this basic point. If there were peace, if the Palestinians could be satisfied perhaps by being bought off a big billion, if they could be able to accept some kind of compromise, some cantonization, some kind of equality in inverted commas, and then they would stop resisting. But every people which is occupied by another people has the right to resist the occupation, whether it's on the West Bank, whether it's Hamas, just as any other country would do.
Would you like to remind the audience the translation of Hamas?
The translation of it?
Yes.
Go on then. Yeah.
It's the resistance party.
Well, of course it is.
Yeah.
So why is it like the Irgun and the Palma and the Sterngang, and they were called terrorist groups when they blew up the King David Hotel? And we said how terrible they were. But they weren't terrible in the sense that they were fighting for their new country. You have to understand their point of view. And as soon as they got their country, the Irgun ideas became...
What's that got to do with it? Some not. Some not. Since when did that matter?
It does matter, of course it matters.
No, it doesn't.
Can we just hear? Okay, so most of them were from Eastern Europe, but let's hear Brian's view.
Yes, I say a terrorist is somebody who fights for something he believes in or she believes in. When he's achieved it, he stops being a terrorist and becomes peacenik and says everybody else who resists is a terrorist.
But actually, like Nelson Mandela and the UN, when it tried to create a definition of a terrorist that excluded Mandela, found it very difficult. But we all admired him because he was a great man.
Is it not the case that Mr. Beeley stayed in his aeroplane at Heathrow Airport because he was due to be arrested on a charge of murder for the murder of Deir Yassin on April the 8th, 1947, when he was responsible for the butchery of over 300 people, in order to get access to Jerusalem. Now, you might think, oh, he's anti-Jewish because he's telling us this story about the massacre. No Israeli denies that massacre. The ones who have read their history books, they say it's regrettable, it's horrible, but had it not happened, Israel would have not got into West Jerusalem in 1949. I mean, war is war. You know, that's what happened. So now the Israeli Defense Force are some kind of bunch of good guys, but they were originally the Palmach, the Stern and the Irgun, and we called them terrorists. Now we're calling the Palestinians, who when I was a kid were rather brave guys fighting as Israeli, Jewish groups like Irgun. And
these Europeans.
Yeah, many of them yes. So life is complicated. I mentioned at the beginning, look, I mentioned at the beginning the problem, ladies and gentlemen, of language. You know, how can we talk about groups without labelling them? I'm not talking.
Human nature here, sir.
Okay.
No.
Right, yes, please.
Yes.
So one thing I've learned about Trump is his transactional style of negotiating.
Yeah.
So if you go up to Williston or whatever at Palestine, and you see there's lots of people of different ethnicities getting along just fine because they're transactional, they're trading. If you go to any talk around London where they're talking about politics, political groups, ideology, ethics, everybody's at each other's necks. So maybe this idea, this transactional Jared Kushner real estate idea, if they sort of target the people in the community, rather than trying to aim for the people in the community that are the religious sort of, stirring up religious fervor, to try to transact leaders in the community that are more pragmatic, the business people. I can see how it might work. No, my question was, just very quickly, somebody, excuse me, because I don't know a lot about, this is my first experience with this, but somebody sniggered, or a few people sniggered, when you mentioned the idea of a Swiss-style canton type system. Why would you snigger at that? Please tell me.
It's a reshuffle of the past. It's just, it's just building up something for the next 200 years, you know? I mean, 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, who lived in this land called Palestine? Canaanites.
But in a way, I mean...
were the Canaanites Jewish? Did they worship Yahweh? No. But the people who invaded their country said, well, if you don't convert to our religion, we're going to wipe you out, but we'll keep the virgins.
I don't think we can go back and back and back. We are where we are now. And I think I would like to hear Brian talk a little bit more about this religious canton idea, if that's what you're wanting to try and understand a bit more. Is it a goer? Is there some possibility in that working?
It's not a goer now, because the Israeli leadership doesn't want to, it doesn't need to withdraw in any way. It is not being obliged to do that. It would be too costly. Even to move the settlers out of the West Bank. 600,000 illegal settlers, only illegal if you are outside Israel. Moving them out would involve almost a civil war, I think. No, Israel doesn't need to do anything. As long as it's got the power and American support to hold on. My idea of the cantonization, again, like most of my ideas, is not original. Some people have said, the essence of if the essence of the problem is religion, why can't we attack it from a religious point of view and have some area? You're shaking your head, but it's an idea. Why can't you say that the parts of Israel that are very, very especially holy to Jews is a Jewish canton, and there's another Jewish canton.
So it would be geographical as well as religious.
Yes.
Sorry, I misunderstood.
Yes. It's only a sort of pie in the sky idea. It's not going to work. There's no reason why it should. Israelis don't want it. Most people would object it. But I suppose my worry about this Trump, just pushing the deal, is that in abstract it sounds wonderful. Let's give them $300 billion just to stop resisting occupation as Palestinians still see it. Then suppose they say, okay, we'll give everything up. Then the problem would be, we can't give any of it to Hamas because they're nasty. We'll give most of it to West Bank. Don't you think that would be a problem? Then the Arabs of East Jerusalem would say, can't we have more of that money, even though we're Israeli now? And the Israelis who are Arabs, are we going to get any of that money? You know, we just happen to be still in the houses we're in 1949.
So
it wouldn't work.
To figure out how to get the money into the right hands.
That's the problem.
The hands of the people, you know, the hands of the people that could actually change the culture.
Can I give an anecdote about something that's being done right now, which is more hopeful than the things we've been talking about?
Hope brings it down.
Yeah, so one of the things I did when I was in Israel was I visited an Arab Jewish school in the northern part of Israel. There's several like these around the country, not nearly enough. But what they do is they have dual teachers. One is an Arab Israeli and the other is a Jewish Israeli. They have evenly divided classrooms, almost exactly equal numbers of Arabs and Jewish kids. And they start at elementary school level, and they go all the way up through the secondary school. And every day, every hour of every day, they spend hearing each other's languages. They speak in both Arabic and Hebrew. They comment on each other's cultures, on each other's observations of the other side. I happened to be there on Independence Day, so the Jewish kids were celebrating it as Independence Day. The Arab kids were celebrating it as Nakba Day. The catastrophe, whatever the translator says. It was a very optimistic idea. It takes the dedication of teachers who are completely free of their own biases and willing to embrace the other side. The problem is it's getting started late, and another problem is scale. But it seemed to be working, and it's certainly an experiment that is worth supporting.
How I wish we had that in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
We have a few.
Sorry, talk about Ireland. Talk about Ireland, not Northern Ireland. That's an imperialist term. Talk about Ireland.
Now I've started off another way. My mother came from Galway.
More Irish over here.
Yeah, we're jealous. This is our country. We were here for 700 years before the Romans, but you brought here the slaves in 1870.
No, what you described obviously is a good thing, and it's what I rather summarize.
Okay, could we hear Brian's response? And I think it is interesting to think about the part of the UK where we have the most obvious sectarian divide, and which has caused a lot of bloodshed over the years, and where, you know, if you say you're a humanist in Northern Ireland, you may well be asked, are you a Protestant humanist or a Catholic humanist? You know, it's a tribal part of our country, and I think it is interesting because there are some parallels with Israel-Palestine, not very many, but there are some. So we can, but let's now hear Brian's response.
Yes, I rather similarly call what you've described as the Barenboim-Said effect. There have been many cases of this across the divide, but they're not going to solve the problem this way. I don't believe. And I'd like to go back to this point about the religious element. If you mention, oh, you're interested in Israel-Palestine conflict, many people immediately think of it as Jewish-Muslim conflict. It becomes a religious conflict. I'm not really sure that it's a religious conflict at all. Many Israelis would agree with me that it is in fact a conflict between nationalism, a Palestinian nationalism, and a Jewish nationalism. Some people would then say, how can you have a Jewish nationalism? Judaism is a religion. You don't have an Anglican nationalism or a Lutheran nationalism, but we've got a Jewish one. And people talk about the Jewish nation. How can you have a Lutheran nation? No, there's no Lutheran nation. And so I think we need to, on this academic level, it's very important to look further at what is the nature of a Jewish state. Can a Jewish state actually have not just a fifth of non-Jewish inhabitants, but any at all?
question you need to ask yourself, sir, if I may, is the opinion of the Israeli Arabs, who much prefer to be under the dominion of an Israeli government than any other Arab government in the whole of the Middle East and North Africa. They are doing very well.
I don't blame them.
Sorry?
I don't blame them. They are 6 times well off.
That's not true. When the leader of the Palestinians in the Knesset came here, that's not what he told us.
I'm sorry, I missed
that's not what he told us.
Okay, excuse me.
That's not what he told us.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's just hear what he speaks to. So what the person said at the back was that when the leader of the Palestinians in the Knesset came to speak in the UK, he didn't say what you've just said, that they were happy in the present situation.
Yeah. I think I said in passing, I think Jewish Arab Israelis are happy in a material sense. The ones I've met are, put it this way, they're happy to go along with it because they are very well off in material terms. If they're ill, they have very good hospital treatment. They've got good schools. But they're not happy if you talk to them at some length and they say, well, I'd like to live there, but they have restrictions on where they can live. I mentioned the restriction on marrying non-Israeli, and they can't join the army, perhaps they don't want to, unless they're Druze, as opposed to Jews. So they do have restrictions, but having restrictions on a section of the population is nothing new. One of the reasons why we had this persecution of Jews in Europe, which produced pogroms and ultimately the Holocaust, was that for centuries Jews had restrictions on them. They couldn't do business, couldn't get into not business, they couldn't get into government, they couldn't get into all kinds of military, they couldn't do this, they couldn't do that. So they were pushed into certain trades, and then they did go so well that they became vilified for it, and the object of persecution. They became the other, the different, the thing. It's my fear at this great age.
Please don't shout out. Put your hand if you want to say something, and I'll come to you. But please don't shout out because it's hard for us to hear.
Probably getting towards the end of this debate.
Yes.
Then the end, I say, that at my great age now, I've grown up through the Second World War, Blitz, and all the rest of it, and now I've come to the conclusion that we have to stop being frightened of the other. All these conflicts, whether it's Israel-Palestine or whatever one you choose, whether it's the one in Belfast, and I've got relatives in Belfast, and the kind of relatives who paint red, white, and blue on their curbstones and makes me very embarrassed. But anyway, if people could stop thinking that I've got to have an other, I've got to have somebody who, because he's not like me, he's different from me, therefore I've got to dislike him, and then build up some kind of image that he's bad, and he's not to be trusted, and he's not to be given what I do. It's my philosophy of life.
Well, there are people like that, and you're called humanists.
I'm just going to finish. Oh, did you want to? We haven't had a question.
Well, just I think that's poppycock.
Not my optimism is poppycock.
Well, it sounds fine in theory.
I know it does.
And I've always been a learner. I've always been on my own, etc., etc., etc. But I learned through experience, you have to join a gang.
Oh.
I saw it in the school playground. I was always the one that was bullied. There were always gangs all around me. As I've grown up, nothing's changed. And everybody's tribal. The Catholics are tribal and look after running Catholics. The Jews are tribal and look after running Jews. Everybody looks after their gang to some extent. And you want to watch your back if you're on your own, if you're not a member of some bloody tribe. Because you get an egg from everybody.
Okay, let me hear that speaker's response.
Let's exchange anecdotes about gangs. As a child, I was some time in a children's home. And we in the home, we boys, little boys, 8, 9, 10 years old, we felt we were being threatened by a gang, get this, of 8, 9, 10-year-olds coming from a nearby town to do us harm. So I, like General Montgomery, got my chums together and armed with gigantic, get with this, gigantic fungi, horrible, smelly, stinking fungus. We charged down the hill pelted these town boys, and they ran off. So I'm all in favour of that kind of gas.
Okay, well sorry, do you want to say something? Yes, say something.
I don't know if you've ever heard Chris Hadfield, I've got the name right, he's the guy who runs the International Space Station, and he says that his prescription for world peace is to have everybody go up there for a stick, because when astronauts arrive, they are very invested in their own identity, and after they've seen a few hundred revolutions of the planet, they stop saying, that's where I live, and then they let into this wonderful, very cosmopolitan community, and all that nonsense stops. So that's what one has to do.
Oh, well, that's a lovely thought. I was going to share with you a slightly different one to bring it to an end, which is about this tendency that we do have to need an other to sort of pit ourselves against, whether it's a football team we support or a country, or I always remember when Rabbi Lionel Blue was on Desert Island Discs, and he was asked what he wanted as his luxury. And he said, well, I'd like to have 2 synagogues, because you've got to have the one you don't go to as well as the one you do go to. And there does seem to be this human tendency, but we do also need to learn to live together. And I'd like you to join with me in thanking tonight's speaker.